I wanted to share with you just something that was I've kind of been mulling over the weekend, and I'm hoping that it helps you, as so many of you are without, whether you know it or not, you're rewriting your emotion story, the story of your emotions. How many of you have heard of the story of your emotions before? So this is really understanding, what is the story that my emotions are telling me. And so if we can understand that there's always a narrative playing behind the emotions, if we can understand what that narrative is, it can actually help us to move through our emotions with a lot greater ease. So I'm probably going to butcher explaining what the story of emotions is, but that's essentially knowing that behind all of your emotions, there's a story that you're telling yourself or is being told to you. So for example, when I was growing up, it was, oh, if you're anxious, you just need medication, instead of what is your anxiety telling you? And that anxiety was telling me that I didn't feel safe in my environment. I didn't feel, emotionally safe. There was a lot of reasons behind that anxiety. Does that make sense? And so if we can understand, same thing with anger, sadness, fear, depression, even, like, what is the story behind the emotion, that's actually going to help us to move through those emotions, and also helps us to remain objective. Because when we're in it, it's like, it is very hard to stay objective with what's going on around us. But if we know, for example, postpartum, a lot of the emotions we feel are simply because of hormones, and they're very radically changing hormones that we have little to no control over, except for nourishing our bodies, getting really good sleep. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, there are things we can do to feel better. We can't necessarily control how we feel because it's controlled by our emotions. So if I were to tell myself in that situation, I'm losing my mind, I'm never going to get better, I'm blah, 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 then that's going to create a very different picture in my head than what I'm actually going through, right? And so, but if I tell myself, you know what, this is hormones, this will pass, I will feel better, I will be getting sleep at some point in the future, then all of a sudden I can shift the story to a less powerless one. You might relate to this, but I remember when God really peeled back the layers on some big anger for me. And I just had to feel it. I just had to feel it for like 2 solid years, and I hated every second of it, but it was good for me. I needed to learn how to feel it. The story that I was telling myself was, anger to me, in my story, in my head, meant like violence. It meant a lack of safety. It meant emotional harm. It meant, like, I had a lot of negative views of anger because that's really only how I saw it used in my home. You know what I'm saying? There was never a conversation about anger. It was never like, oops, I blew it, let's, figure this out. So my story about the anger that I was feeling actually led me to feel unsafe feeling the feeling of anger. Does that make sense? Because it's like, oh, that equals emotional unsafety. So I had to learn how to, like, rewrite the story of what anger was telling me. Like, no, I'm safe in my body. What is anger trying to point me to? Like, what is the thing that it's trying to tell me? Because if we can understand that, then one, it takes the judgment and the shame out of our experience. Like, I'm feeling this anger, and God says not, God doesn't say not to be angry. He says, in your anger, don't sin, which is different, right? And I personally believe we can actually sin against ourselves and God by not having a healthy expression of anger. When we shove it down, where does it go? It either explodes or it implodes, right? And so when we begin to really, like, zoom out on that emotion and be like, okay, why am I feeling this emotion? If I'm feeling anger because I'm in pain, then I can take the judgment and the shame out of the anger, because that's just the front emotion. So I wanted to just kind of present that idea of, the story of your emotions, because it's actually going to lead us to the next thing that I'm going to talk to you about, which is the shame story or the self-compassion story. And this is just literally something that I've kind of been dialoguing with the Lord about probably the last couple of weeks, which is, what is the language that I use about myself when I'm going through something? Is it a shame story or is it a self-compassion story? So, for example, when Alexis was about 9 months old, you guys heard this a million times, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. Really bad postpartum depression, but it wasn't just that. It was my dad had passed away. My mom was having a mental health crisis. And so I was left without really any support, and all of my childhood stuff was coming up at the same time. So I was not able to go back to work because basically my body shut down, and my body was telling me like, hey girlfriend, we have some things we need to do and you better wake up and pay attention. That's basically what my body was saying. Like, you are not Superwoman. You need to slow down and look at what's going on in your internal world and sort this stuff out. But my story, I had zero compassion for myself, you guys. The compassion that I'm able to bring to other people, I was not able to give to myself. And that's because I was loaded with shame over what I was experiencing. Like, I'm ashamed that I'm not bringing in an income. I'm ashamed that I'm not able to be the wife that my husband needs me to be right now. I'm ashamed that I have needs, really is what it came down to. And so that was the story that I was telling myself. And so my goal was to get better so that nobody, like, that I wouldn't need anybody for anything, which is so unhealthy. Like, so unhealthy. But how many of us are doing that because we don't want to inconvenience other people into loving us right where we are? And so I really felt like the Lord just kept highlighting it over and over and over last week. Like, we need to talk about the shame story, because so many of us are trying to move out of what our circumstances or what we're feeling, and rightfully so, because some of them are really, really hard circumstances, but we're doing it from a place of shame and guilt instead of self-compassion. So shame, I'm just going to give some language to what shame sounds like, because it sounds very different for different people. But I actually had a good friend of mine, call me out on this a couple weeks ago, when I had kind of a meltdown over the mold situation or the water situation. I was like, I'm so done. I'm just done with everything. And I was like, and why can't I just get myself together? And I should know better. And like, it just all came blah, blah, spilling out. And in case you guys think I have it all together, I don't. I just have language for walking through this stuff. And she said, Andrea, you're using a lot of shame language. Can we talk about that? She's like, why won't you just let people love you right here and just like curl up on the floor and cry about it? Like, it's okay. It's okay that this is hard. And I was like, oh, why do I still have that language? Like, because it's been a long time since I've had that creep up. Like, why am I resisting? And so I realized there was a story that I was telling myself about a lot of the things that kind of led up to that little meltdown, right? And so shame, it sounds like, how dare I need something? I'm bad. If I had just done X, Y, and Z, if I had just caught this sooner, if I had just paid better attention to myself, if I had not ignored that doctor's appointment for 9 months, if I had blank, 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 right? Which really, it can kind of be peeled back to a little bit. There's some grief in there too, right? Because grief is it's that bargaining stage of grief where it's like, if I had just, then I wouldn't be here. Where we're retracing our steps to see how could I have prevented this, when reality is maybe there was nothing that could have prevented it, And so if we take on that shame, that's like, I'm bad. If I could just muster up the strength or muster up the perseverance or muster up the hope or what have you, then I wouldn't be what? And I want you guys to fill that in, because you each have your own story there. And for me, as I've been allowing myself to look into that a little bit deeper, because God's bringing some deeper healing in some areas, I'm recognizing that really what it comes down to is not wanting to be a burden and not wanting to have needs. And I don't fully have a revelation as to why that is yet. I have some ideas, But I'm realizing like, wow, so much of my motivation has been coming from that place of that, not wanting to be a burden, not wanting to have needs. And so when you fill in that blank, then you want to add into it because blank. Because that means what does that mean? Maybe it means somebody's going to emotionally withdraw from you. It leads to a place of feeling powerless or hopeless or fearful. And so it's just easier to put on that strong front than it is to say, I'm afraid to say that I have a need, because what's the point? Nobody's going to meet it. And so we have to be, and your story is going to be different than mine. Like the language may not be exactly the same, but if you can take that principle and say, okay, but why am I resisting? Why don't I go to, my husband for comfort? Or why don't I go to, and there may be some valid reasons why you don't. I'm not saying they're not valid, but I'm saying that if we want to be healthy, we have to look at that story and say, you know what? Jesus took care of all shame on the cross, which means I don't actually get to walk in it. It doesn't glorify him. It doesn't honor him. It doesn't make him love me more to say like, gosh, I'm covered in shame. He took care of all of that. And so, there's this, I don't know if you've ever read any of Brennan Manning's books. He wrote this amazing book called Ruthless Trust, and Abba's Child, and there's a couple other ones, but I think Ruthless Trust is probably one of my absolute favorites. It really helped to restore my faith in God after my dad died, because I was like just in the trenches of all of it, right? And questioning all the different things that I'd experienced up to that point. But one of the things that he said is that Jesus is the enemy of self-hatred and shame. And I love that quote, because whenever I feel that shame or that self-hatred, and maybe you wouldn't even call it self-hatred because that feels like too strong of a word, but any place that you're rejecting yourself because of what you're going through is a form of self-hatred. So when I recognize that Jesus is the enemy of self-hatred, then he's just basically begging me to let go of any place that I'm holding on to that idea that I could be repulsive to him or too much for him, simply because maybe I was too much for somebody else. So we have to understand the shame story, the story that shame is telling us. And if, back to like some of those emotional regulation tools that we've talked about, if it feels too much to go there, like maybe you can only spend 5 minutes on looking at your shame story. That's okay. Maybe it's only 2 minutes. Like, okay, I could only get that first word and that was too much and I just wanted to run for the hills. Like, that's okay. It's okay. It really is okay. This is a process of healing, right? This is a process and a journey of discovering how God means to restore and recover the areas that the enemy's taken from us, or that we've even let other people take from us, right? But we do have to understand that shame story in order to move into the self-compassion story. So the things that I was not able to offer myself during that time, I had people, like I would just stonewall. I remember I had a nurse friend, because I was, working 40 hours a week, 9 months pregnant while my dad's on hospice, and thinking nothing, guys, I'm like, I just want to go back and give little me a hug. Like, that was a rough time. And I remember I had a nurse friend tell me, she's like, Andrea, you're so stoic. I would never have known. I literally would never have known. And I was like, all proud of myself, like, yeah, I'm putting up a brave front. And then it totally blew up in my face, right? And so afterwards, and I remember coming back to the unit to get my stuff from my locker because I wasn't coming back from maternity leave, and feeling so embarrassed, like that I just couldn't pull it together. And I had one of my nurse friends just give me a hug and say, I'm so sorry. And I couldn't, like, I still, even in that place, like could not connect to the fact that I needed compassion for where I was at, for what I had been through. And so now, like, there are things even now that the Lord will bring up and say, hey, we need to have a conversation with 26-year-old Andrea, because she's still hurting over that thing. So what are the things that, what is the self-compassion there? Like, what is the empathy? there? What are the things you would say to somebody else walking through what you're walking through right now? And are you willing to offer that to yourself? It's a lot harder to look ourselves in the mirror and saying, you know what, this is really hard. And you're doing a really good job. I'm proud of you for showing up. You know, if you have a bad grief day, or you're walking through infertility and you have a bad day where anxiety takes over and you don't want to hope because it's scary, you can still offer that compassion for yourself and say, you know what, I'm proud of you. This is really hard. One of the things that sometimes I will do, I will kind of pull back if I'm recognizing that, like, gosh, I'm having a really hard time being kind to myself. And usually I recognize this because it's really hard for me to receive the kindness of other people first. And that only comes when I'm not really being that nice to myself, right? And I'm not like a bully. I'm not a bully in my head, but maybe I'm just like muscling through and I'm not being compassionate. I'm not giving myself rest. I'm not whatever it is that I need, right? I will pull back and I will be like, if the most loving person was in the room with me right now, what would I need from them? Maybe it's a hug or just like some validation. Do you know what I'm saying? Somebody to make you bread and tea and say, sit down and let's just cry about it. You know what I mean? Sometimes it's easier to know what we need when we're able to pull back and think about times where somebody has really truly cared for us. And then that can be like, okay, maybe I can do that for myself. Like tomorrow's the anniversary of my dad's death. And I have not once, the Lord actually really challenged me last week. He said, Andrea, you have not once done something nice for yourself on the day that he died. I want you to go buy yourself flowers. And I was like, I am not doing that. Um, that was my internal response, but I'm going to do it. And I'm going to post a picture in the Facebook group tomorrow as accountability for myself. But I have friends that always buy me flowers on his anniversary. And half the time I forget until it's later in the day and I'm like, why am I so teary today? Well, yeah, my body knows. So do you see what I'm saying though? Like if you can look back, and this would go under the homework for your self-compassion story, okay, is to go back and think about times where other people have met you where you are, and you just felt that, like, the loving care of humans and God, right? Where it's like, man, I felt so seen and loved and cared for that it was like, oh, I could breathe for a minute. And I want you to think about ways that you can begin incorporating that same language, that same compassion, that same self-validation into the story that you're walking out right now. And if you don't have memories of that, I'm going to pray that the Lord reminds you and that he begins to build that history with you. Because one of the things the Lord reminded me of recently was there was a time in junior high where my parents were like on the verge of divorce, and it was a bad time, just a bad time. And, you know, me being super stoic and middle child, got to pull myself up from the bootstraps and just like figure things out. I remember just like breaking down at youth group one night. I didn't tell anybody what was going on. I just sat there and sobbed during worship. And I will never forget this. This older woman just sat down next to me and started rubbing my back and saying, it's okay, honey. Whatever you're going through, it's okay. And I just like, I think I fell over into her lap. Like I just was like, oh, and I just started crying. But I remember that moment because it was so like, I don't have parents that are like, my parents are here, but they're so in their own world of trouble right now that they're not able to be here for me, right, in the way that I needed. And I was genuinely scared of like, I don't know if my parents are divorcing. So like I bucked up, I got a job, I got my license. I like just, you know, as a 15-year-old, that's a lot of responsibility. And so, and looking back, I used to always look at this as like, wow, look how amazing you are. Until my husband said, Andrea, that is not normal. Like a little bit confrontive, right? I was like, what do you mean? He's like, that's not normal. That is not healthy. That is not normal. And it's no wonder you have a hard time resting. And so then I was able to connect like, oh, I was not ever able to go back and have some compassion for 15-year-old Andrea or 26-year-old Andrea. That was, do you see what I'm saying? That all of these things that are a part of my story, but I was still walking in that shame story because, and I'm hoping that this is connecting with you guys, because I would not have called it shame, you guys, not even probably 3 weeks ago. I would have called it like self-reliance or like performance, maybe. Probably wouldn't have called it shame. But where was that self and reliance and performance coming from? Shame of having needs, right? And so now I can see like, wow, okay, what are the areas that, that shame, if we were to draw like a little circle and and maybe you will do this, throughout the week, do whatever way makes the most sense to your brain. But like, if we were to have a shame bubble, right? If you can see that. And inside of that are all the words or circumstances that you would use to describe what you're feeling. Now I can take that and be like, wow, where are the areas that I actually need to validate myself and offer some self-compassion? And I'm not just talking about like, it does start with how we talk about ourselves, I think, in the sense of like, this is a really hard thing. It's okay that I had a hard day. Maybe my anxiety is a little bit higher right now because we have, this crazy house situation and my whole downstairs is a mess. Kat knows. I sent her a picture. It's a hot disaster. And that gives me a little bit of like internal anxiety because I can't like clean my own environment, like just that basic thing. So I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna, instead of yelling at myself internally for being frustrated, like how dare I get frustrated, right? It's, you know what? This is really hard. I don't like having a messy kitchen. This is hard for me. And so take a couple deep breaths. I'm going to pour myself some tea. And I've noticed myself really leaning into things that are nourishing, like really nourishing things, like reading books instead of watching TV, like just naturally like inclined towards those things. And I'm realizing it's because my soul really needs some rest in those areas. And because the Lord is also simultaneously exposing, just like he is through your individual stories, areas where I've carried some shame that he's wanting to rewrite that story. Does that make sense? Okay. So self-compassion, the self-compassion story includes radical acceptance. Now, this is a dialectic tool, which is basically just a fancy word for a certain type of therapy. But a dialectic tool means you're able to hold two things simultaneously. Okay. So it's like it can be as simple as there are a million reasons why we got to this point. There are a million reasons why I'm at this point of anger. There are a million reasons why my marriage is at this point or my health is at this point. And I can radically accept all of the things that led up to this point and let them be what they are instead of judging and shaming, right? Which is like, I should have done this. I should have done that. I should have gone to that doctor's appointment. I should have blah, 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 right? Now there is a place of ownership in the sense of like, when you realize that thing that maybe you could have done different, right? It's like, okay, I see that. Lesson learned. Moving on. It doesn't have to be a big thing, right? But when we allow it to become a big thing, then we partner with fear on it because we're like, I'm never going to do that again. And I hope I learn my mistakes so that I don't ever end up in this position ever again, right? So it can be very easy to partner with fear on that. But that radical acceptance is accepting all of the things that led to this point. So for me, when I was walking through all the stuff after Alexis was born, it was basically, instead of being like, well, if my mom hadn't been an abuser and if my dad hadn't been so apathetic and if I had just had my basic needs met, I wouldn't be in this place. There is a place of grief and actually processing the grief of what you've been through. I'm not saying we skip over that part, We do have to work through that part to get to that radical acceptance. But for me, they kind of worked in tandem, where it was like, I am radically accepting that all of these things led up to this pot of garbage stew. We'll just use that analogy, dumpster fire of my life, right? And now I just have to unpack it. I have to take ownership of the things that have led up to this. There is no point in throwing a pity party for myself. I am going to grieve, but I'm also going to heal. Does that make sense? So that radical acceptance first, and then the radical acceptance that we are beloved above everything else that we are going through. And that just like I was saying, that Jesus is the enemy of self-hatred. When we understand that we are truly beloved, it enables us to walk out our story in a completely different way. Because now it's not, okay, there's this verse in Isaiah that I'm going to see if I can find it, but now it's not, you're the deserted wife, right? Or Hannah who's infertile or what have you. You're not, that's not your story, right? And so that's a part of the story. But when Jesus says in Isaiah, or not Jesus, sorry, when it says in Isaiah, sing, O barren woman, you who have never given birth. Then it talks about being like a deserted wife who has no husband. And that speaks to those emotions of abandonment and betrayal. And Jesus is like, behold, I will make you new. So there is this, do you see the tension of what, like, we read that and we're like, yeah, you just make me new, but we're like we're actively walking out that place of tension where God is meeting us in the place of our betrayal, in the place of our disappointment. And so radically accepting that we are beloved even as we are walking out these things, meaning that, so for me, actually, my husband and I were talking about this last night, like the shame that happens when you have a child with special needs. Okay. I'm just going to use this particular example. There's a lot of different places. And the Lord actually had me spend about a year like working through some of that stuff, because it was the shame of people not understanding us. It was the shame of people telling us that we had just sinned, and that's why our daughter was sick. It was the shame. I know, guys, trust me. I almost throat punched the person. I'm not even joking. Like, and I go to church with them, and I was just like, don't even like tell me where in the Bible it says that. But anyways, that's besides the point. There's the shame of people misunderstanding you. There's the shame of having services denied. Like even that simple thing of like, she doesn't qualify for a disability because we don't recognize this as an illness. You know what I'm saying? And so it's the shame of not having enough money to cover the things that you need. It's the shame of your marriage being in a place of struggle because your child is struggling. It's the shame of, you know what I'm saying? And so in that place, it was like I had to radically accept that in spite of all of these things, God loves my family. And even though there are people that don't understand that and that have walked away, that have whatever, misunderstood, whatever, I am the beloved of God. Do you see how that like changes? It doesn't change the circumstance that you're walking through, but it changes how I walk through it. Because now it's not coming from that place of striving, right? Because shame, when I feel shame, I want to perform my way out of it. I want to get as far away from that feeling as I can possibly feel. And yet it's like, okay, well, shame is leading to these behaviors, right? Maybe it's, I'm going to work harder so I can make more money so that I don't feel the lack that I'm feeling, or whatever it is in your situation, right? You guys are probably getting some ideas here. It leads to that fear and that performance. And so when I can say, you know what, I am the beloved of God. And so my anxiety doesn't define how much God loves me. My fear, my anger, my frustration, the struggles in my relationships, the things my children are walking through. None of that gets to define how God's going to come through for me. And then we can offer ourselves that comfort and that self-compassion, like Isaiah, I think it's Isaiah 54. I'll put it in the group. That's talking about, it's saying, behold, you lashed by storms and not comforted. Behold, I will rebuild you. But he can't rebuild it if we're not willing to recognize what's broken, right? And that it's okay to be messy, and it's okay that things are hard, and it's okay that it's not this perfectly wrapped up bow on a present. Okay, so self-compassion, I'm just going to go through this list again, requires and includes radical acceptance, the acceptance of the circumstances that got you to this point, because when we can accept that, then it's a lot easier to take steps out of it, right? It includes being radically accepted as a beloved first, not that you have to earn your belovedness, but that you are the beloved of God in spite of your circumstances. It's also the radical acceptance of our needs, that our needs are our needs and they are non-negotiables. They don't require justification. Your needs to have healthy emotions, good sleep, food on a table, emotional stability, the emotional stability of others around you, those are non-negotiables. You don't have to negotiate them with yourself, and you don't have to negotiate them with other people, which is really hard to do. It gets easier, but it's hard to do it. It's harder for me to do that for myself than it is to have boundaries with other people sometimes. But it's also the radical acceptance of our humanity and the need for grace, and that Jesus is so willing to be totally okay. He's not just willing to be totally okay. He is totally okay with your humanity. He's not going to leave you there, but he doesn't despise it either. And so I think, this is a journey of recovering, you know what I'm saying, and restoring. It's not like a one size fits all happens overnight, but I wanted to give you guys some language for untangling some of that, because I think even in going through like the keys to emotional freedom, right, we can become performance based. Like, I got to get through my anger, right? I got to check off that box on my list. I got to get through my sadness. I got to check that box off my list because it's uncomfortable, but also because for the majority of us, we're still carrying some shame around those particular emotions. And that has to be dealt with. And not dealt with as in like, file it away and never look at it again. Dealing with it means allowing it to be present and allowing the Lord to love you there and allowing yourself to love you there. And that's, I've been in this process for 12 years now, and I still have stuff come up sometimes that I'm like, wow, okay, I'm still in need of some, self-compassion and some kindness and some, some mercy and some understanding of my own humanity, that it's okay to have needs. Yeah, because, it's easy to say like, I rebuke you, shame, than it is to look at why it's there in the first place and really take ownership of like, you know what? God wants me to hang up that coat. It doesn't belong to me anymore. So if shame no longer gets to tell the story, then who is writing the story? Jesus is, right? And you are. And that's a lot prettier, and a lot more hope-filled.